Welcome. I'm David Peterson, Professor of Renaissance History here at Washington and Lee University. It's August 13th, 2018. I'm in the Mason Taylor New Room with my good friend and colleague, Professor Theodore C. Delaney, Professor of African American Studies, co-founder of the Africana Studies Minor, holder of the Redenbaugh Chair for Distinguished Teaching, recipient of numerous honorary degrees, fellowships and awards and positions in scholarly societies. This is going to be the first of what we hope will be a series of conversations about Ted's very interesting life, a life that encompasses the history of Lexington, the history of Washington and Lee, and indeed the history of our nation. So without further ado, I'd like to begin by asking Ted if you could tell us where you were born and when.
I was born right here in Lexington, Virginia, October 18, 1943. And I was born in my grandparents' home at 7 Tucker Street in Lexington. And I would hasten to point out that in the early 1940s, most people were born at home rather than in medical facilities. So I was born in my grandparents' home where my parents were residing at that particular point.
Could you talk a little bit about your family, your parents, your siblings, where your people came from?
3 of my grandparents are from Rockbridge County. Both of my maternal grandparents were from Rockbridge County. And I'm pretty certain that my maternal grandmother was actually born here in Lexington. And their names were Charles Henry and Margaret Jane Jones Franklin. And my paternal grandmother was born in Natural Bridge, and her name was Ruby Carter Delaney. Only my paternal grandfather was not a Virginian. He was born in Knoxville, Tennessee. His name was Sterling Byers Delaney. So those are my 4 grandparents. And I had one during my early childhood, during my first 11 years, I only had one sibling, and that was a younger brother named Charlie, who was named for my maternal grandfather. Charles Henry was his name, in fact. And so I grew up with Charlie and with a cousin whose mother was my sister, whose mother was my mother's sister, and her nickname was Candy. So it was the 3 of us. I was 2 years older than Candy, 3 years older than Charlie, and so it was the 3 of us together for most of my life.
Mm-hmm. Could you share with us some of your earliest childhood memories of the Diamond Hill neighborhood, the traditionally African-American neighborhood of Lexington?
Well, the African-American neighborhood in Lexington was a lot larger than it is now. And one of the reasons for that is that in 1928, Lilburn Downing's present location opened. And soon it developed. Lilburn Downing School's present location opened in 1928. And soon thereafter, they began to push toward getting at least 1 or 2 high school years added to the school. The result of Lilburn Downing School opening was that it caused black folks to move in from the county so that their children would have an opportunity to get an education. There were no school buses, and so the idea that you moved in from places like there was a black community near Collierstown, for instance, and they had a church out there that had a Sabbath school attached, and Sabbath schools oftentimes were schools that taught the 3 R's. And so that church sort of becomes defunct when these people move into Lexington to give their children a chance to be educated. So the black community grows, And the black community is on the east side of Lexington, and it really has three divisions to it. One part of the black community is south of Nelson Street Bridge, which is a bridge that in my lifetime I've never been able to understand because it just cuts off a hill. And so otherwise there would have been a steep hill that people drove down and then drove up the other side. But on the other side of that bridge was the African American community that sometimes called itself Centerville, sometimes called itself Mudtown. But interestingly enough, my maternal great-grandparents' home, that bridge was built straight in front of their house. And so when I was a kid, you could walk across that bridge and look directly into their upstairs windows. But that great-grandfather made bricks, and he was sort of a building contractor, and so he sort of had a business of his own that was going on in that part of the black community. The other part of the black community that was pretty central was the black community that encompassed Tucker Street, Henry Street, Randolph Street, Massey Street, Fuller Street, Lewis Street, and that area was called Green Hill. And the one that most people associate, and it's mostly because Little Rendowning School is on that street, is Diamond Street, and which is a steep hill. And so that whole neighborhood and the streets that are clustered around Diamond Street becomes Diamond Hill. And so when I was growing up, all of that neighborhood was, and the three divisions that I've mentioned were black residences. And those, so there are a lot more black people in town than there are now. And a lot of those neighborhoods now have in the more recent past been communities where student housing has been, and those students have occupied what was formerly black homes.
Mm-hmm. But what memories do you have of your early boyhood? Happy memories?
Most of my memories of my boyhood are very happy. In fact, most of my memories are the same kind of memories that children have anyway. Children find ways to entertain themselves and to have fun. There is absolutely no recreational stuff in Lexington for kids who were growing up who were black when I was growing up. So you had to entertain yourselves, and entertaining yourselves meant finding ways to play and keep entertained with those playmates who were your siblings or your relatives or those who were close by. And so some of the close by neighbors also would have been playmates that would have been across racial lines, because there's a thin barrier all through the South, but in Lexington too, with where a black neighborhood ends and a white neighborhood begins. Mm-hmm. And growing up on Tucker Street, one of the interesting realities is that the perpendicular street was Washington Street. And so Washington Street was sort of a mixed street. There were both black and white families on Washington Street. But one family in particular whose yard was sort of on the other side of the fence from our yard was the Munger family. And Bob and Betty Munger were fairly well known in Lexington. He was a physician. He was they were Sally Mann's parents, but Sally wasn't born at the time. But Sally's older brothers were my playmates across the fence from our backyard. And so in that instance, here were little white boys that I was playing with when I was growing up. But on the other hand, Lexington was completely a Jim Crow town. It was completely segregated. The Mungers were very liberal white folks, but they lived there on Washington Street in a house that is presently right next door to Dr. Cruz's office when I was a small boy. And of course, the house where Dr. Cruz's office is that's been greatly expanded on, was a white home. But if you cross the street to that place where Cornet Tax is, that house was owned and occupied by an elderly black woman when I was a child and was growing up. And there were other black families who had homes on Washington Street as well.
Well, the issue of segregation has already come up in a sense in recalling your childhood. When did you realize or become aware of the fact that you were living in a segregated society?
That's really sort of hard to date. One of the things that I mentioned to you before is that you can sort of link that with Stonewall Jackson Hospital, and we can talk about that for a little while. Stonewall Jackson Hospital, when I was a kid, was in the Stonewall Jackson home, and there'd been a lot of adjacent buildings that had been attached to that building to make it a hospital. A hospital that opened in 1909 and closed in 1954. And if black families used that hospital, they had to transfer their care to a white physician, because the two black physicians who lived in Lexington when I was growing up, Dr. John Gilmore and Dr. Alfred Pleasance, were not allowed to practice in a hospital because they were black. And so if you were going to be a patient in the hospital, you had to transfer your care to that of a white physician in order to be in the hospital. When I was 9 years old, with no explanation to me or my cousin or my younger brother, we were paraded into the hospital to have our tonsils removed. And there was a black ward in the Stonewall Jackson Hospital. There was one room that had 5 beds in it, and that was the only place black patients could be. And our mothers were pretty upset about us being in there because there was an elderly black woman in that same room who was dying. And so I can remember the issue and the fact that there was this great fear on the part of my mother and my aunt that we might witness this lady die while we were recovering from our tonsillectomy. That didn't happen, but that's an early memory of racial division, the black ward in Stonewall Jackson Hospital. Certainly there are other memories that, as I think about it, I was in 6th grade when the Brown v. Board of Education decision was promulgated, and certainly that is a time where teachers are emphasizing change that's coming with regard to race relations. And interestingly enough, the teachers were sometimes more optimistic about the changes that would come than the state of Virginia was, because the state of Virginia adopted a plan called Massive Resistance, which outlasted my years in the public school system, because when I graduated from high school in 1961, it was still a segregated high school, and Rockbridge County schools were still segregated, as were schools in most of Virginia. So Brown v. Board did not change things overnight.
So in a sense, your response to segregation was hopeful. I've read interviews with other African Americans, maybe older than you, lived in an earlier age, where, well before 1954, some people have spoken of feeling angry about it, ashamed or stoic. I mean, I have read a number of interviews in which African Americans have said they simply, I wouldn't say accepted segregation stoically, but just accepted it as something that was in the world, their situation, and wasn't going to change.
I think a lot of those views are hindsight views. Having done interviews of people about desegregation, the hindsight views are the ones that oftentimes bother me. Nobody was really ashamed during the time. They might have been annoyed about the lack of opportunities, but to be ashamed, what's to be ashamed of? They didn't create segregation. There was nothing they could do to change it. And so it seems to me the shame and...
Well, maybe anger is a better word.
Well, I think shame is worth talking about because I've encountered this with a lot of students. And students who don't want to acknowledge very humble jobs or very menial jobs that blacks had in the past. That was honest work. And sometimes those people were quite happy in those menial jobs that they had and were proud of what they were doing. And so this whole idea of being ashamed of something is something that is hindsight and is something that a different generation sort of inflicts on the past, and which is always a problem. Stoicism, I also have a hard time with that. One of the things that I can tell you about growing up in a segregated society is that black people were perfectly happy with what they had. They were unhappy about the lack of opportunities. They were unhappy about the way they were oftentimes treated in discriminatory or rude ways. But with regard to their own society, that is not the case at all. One of the things that blacks did have were their own institutions, and their own institutions that provided social outlets for them. And the black institutions also were very, very different in that regard, is that they fulfilled needs that the community had in ways that parallel institutions across racial lines may not be having to address the same kinds of needs in the white community. The whole idea of this Lilburn Downing School, once again, it was almost like the community felt ownership there. It wasn't just the kids in the high school, but it was a mutual experience that all black people in Rockbridge County came to have, is going to Lilburn Downing School. And the fact that they were bused past white schools in the morning on very long, circuitous routes to get to Lexington was not something that angered them, but they were excited about coming into Lexington to go to school where they would be with other members of the African American community. Some of my classmates came from as far away as Glasgow. And so a 20-mile ride on a school bus in the morning, where sometimes they boarded the school bus as early as 6 a.m. for a 9 o'clock school. They weren't unhappy, they weren't angry about it, and they were delighted with the fact that they loved the school. There were people that would have been angry if desegregation had come while they were still in high school. And so it's a complicated thing. So I never remember feeling anger at the time with regard to the fact that the society was segregated. The only times I felt anger was when I was mistreated. And mistreatment could be a fairly common thing. To be treated rudely in a store, or to be treated rudely for some reason because you were black. One vivid memory I have of a Sunday afternoon, I was out riding my bicycle, and there was across from the State Theater, there was a place called a State Drug Store, which was just a lunch counter that served drinks and sandwiches and stuff, and it was segregated, but black people could go in and buy a drink or whatever, as long as you didn't sit down. You could get a drink at the end of the counter. I'm on a bicycle, so I don't want a carry-out, so I ordered a large fountain drink, and I'm drinking it near the door inside of the establishment. And I'm nearly finished it and ready to go out and get on my bike and ride away, and the waitress noticed that I had consumed it inside of the store, and she started chewing me out. You know better than this. You're not supposed to drink this in here. Times like that, you do get angry. And I must have been 13 or 14 years old, and I was angry because I was being treated in a very, very rude fashion. But other than that, life was not a time that you spent griping and complaining and, oh, woe is me because I'm black, because that was not the way we lived.
What were some of the most important do's and don'ts that a young black man had to learn in this kind of society?
One of the things that has certainly been a necessity in black culture for a very long time is to learn how to stay out of trouble that is going to be trouble with regard to interracial relations somehow. And one of the most extraordinary things about growing up for me was that the most famous lynching of the 1950s occurred when I was about 12 years old, and that is the murder of Emmett Till in Money, Mississippi. Emmett Till was 2 years older than me, and so Emmett Till sort of ends up being one of those examples for black families to point to. You don't want to end up like that. And in this case, and of course we know now from this famous interview last year that he really had not gotten fresh with the woman. She said she made the story up, but it's not to cross a line with a white woman, or it's not to cross a line with a white girl, or it's to be very conscious of your station in life so as that you don't cross any lines that might end up with those kinds of violent repercussions. And black families were always afraid of lynching. And so there is this latter-day lynching in 1955 that gets national attention only because the mother of Emmett Till wants him to have an open coffin so the world can see what they did to her son, that black magazines published. And so there was that moment that there was this national news, and so that black families could point and say, that's why we want you to watch what you do. That's why we want you to be safe. And so the Emmett Till murder is very important, and it seems to me that that very, very same kind of message is black families still try to teach their children as they come of age.
Was there ever, aside from Emmett Till, which was a national phenomenon, was there a sense of present danger closer to home? Was there violence in this area any?
Well, I'm kind of amused by the question, and the reason is that my mother always thought there was. And my mother always was very, very conscious of the idea that this kind of danger existed. And my mother was a bit overprotective, and so at least for me, there was this reality that my mother perceived that there was that kind of danger. On the other hand, on an academic level, having researched Virginia history during that period, I know that Virginia, probably alone among southern states, passed tough anti-lynching laws during the 1920s. And Governor Harry Byrd didn't like lynching because he argued that it gave the South a bad name. And so Virginia probably was a fairly safe state to live in with regard to those kinds of dangers after the 1920s and certainly by the 1940s and 50s. But my mother didn't know that. And I would surmise that most black families did not know that either. And so I am a man in my 50s when I learned that Virginia has strict anti-lynching laws that go into place in the 1920s. And so to that extent, the fear was there. The fear was certainly there in the black community. And I would also argue, as a student of Southern history, that white families who were bigoted were probably happy that the fear was still there, because the fear would have been perceived as a deterrent of some sort. But I don't think that there was a real danger with regard to that kind of thing when I was growing up.
I've been told that Lexington in the 40s and 50s, race relations were relatively civil.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I would not say that at all. When you have total segregation in a community, and when you have people who are not easily able to register to vote in a community, those are not civil relationships. And I have a real hard time with viewing relationships as civil when they are as divided as Lexington was when I was growing up.
Mm-hmm. So there definitely were places you should not go and things you should not do. And
there were places that you should not go. The only two integrated places that I can think of in Lexington when I was growing up was a public library. And God knows that was a godsend, because on Saturdays we could go to the public library and check out books and have them for 2 weeks or however long we wanted. So the public library was one place that was not segregated. The other place that was not segregated was St. Patrick's Catholic Church, which is the parish I grew up in. And so there were always a few black members of St. Patrick's, but everything else in Lexington was totally segregated.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like your mother gave you most of your mentoring on do's and don'ts, places to go.
Well, my parents were divorced when I was about 10 years old, and my father, prior to that, would be away working all day, and so I didn't see my father very much. And so my mother was my mentor, and my mother's way of mentoring was sometimes a little bit bizarre, and to the extent that I work hard and I have to work to feed you guys, and so you will not get in trouble because I don't have the time to go get you out of trouble. And so that was the kind of mentoring that we got. And she also knew, but I had a large extended family network in Lexington too, so they always knew where we were and what we were up to. So there's more mentoring actually that happens from my mother's family than just my mother. So.
Yeah, well, I guess they relied on the extended family because if I've understood correctly, both your parents will have been working.
Yeah, but my mother was able to oftentimes either work in a family business when it was on Main Street or at home. My grandfather had 7 children. He had 1 son and 6 daughters. And he could not afford to educate them, but he used to boast about teaching them his trade, and he was a barber. And so he taught several of his daughters, including my mother, how to be barbers. And my grandfather had a barber shop on Main Street in the block that was between Washington and Henry for, my God, she was maybe 50 years. I don't know how long that barber shop was there. But my mother ran the barber shop, and she ran the barber shop after he died in the early 50s. But when she stopped running the barber shop, she set up a shop at home. And so she had people who would come to the house for barbering or for hairdressing. But I would also say that my grandfather was not the only person who had a business who was black, who had a business in that block of Main Street. There were 2 black restaurants in that block. There was another black barber shop in that block. One of the black restaurants was where the shop for Pavagallos is, and that was an Oddfellows building that was owned by a black lodge. The other side of that building was a black billiards hall. And so there were black businesses in that portion of Main Street. That reminds me, then there was another desegregated place in Lexington. That was my grandfather's barber shop, because he boasted of being able to cut both black and white hair. And so he had people who were in his barber shop who were both black and white.
Oh, so he had white customers.
Yeah.
It's interesting. What were some of the greatest cruelties that you saw as a young man?
I'm sorry?
What were some of the greatest, or even one of the greatest cruelties that you saw as a young man? You have mentioned being offended at being scolded in the soda shop unjustly, but did you see worse things happen to other people?
Right now, I can't really come up with something that I would say that was worse than being scolded in a shop like that. I can remember once my grandmother's sister was very upset about being called auntie by a clerk in a store when she was checking out. And so there were always those kinds of demeaning things that were demeaning. I'm not sure that it's more cruel than demeaning, but...
Little verbal slights and this sort of thing.
Right. So probably had some of those kinds of things to happen when I was a boy. That when I was a teenager, I had a gardening job, and it was really kind of funny when I think about the view that one gets of how the other half lives when you have jobs like this. But I had a gardening job, and I was really making a lot of money for a 16-year-old. And the gardening job was at the house where Sally Richmond presently lives. It was called the Fletcher House then. And the yard is huge, and it has rock gardens. It was a really beautiful place, but it was being rented by an elderly couple whose last name was anglicized, pronounced Barsina, because the elderly woman in this marriage had anglicized her Mexican husband's name, who was Barsina. And so they hired me, and I was making $1 an hour, and he was quite a character, and he would spend a lot of time in the yard talking to me as I was working in the gardens. And And I really enjoyed working for him and doing what I was doing. And he also was a real friend of Jack Daniels, and frequently had a drink in his hand. And one afternoon he had had enough to drink that he decided that he wanted to invite me into dinner. And it was an extremely interesting and awkward situation because my mother's oldest sister was their maid and cook. And so I learned from the conversation that I'm not hearing from inside of the house as well. But his wife, who was originally from Buffalo, New York, was completely humiliated that he would invite me in to sit down at the table to eat dinner with them. And so me sitting at table with them did not happen, but at 16 years old, it's sort of an interesting thing to witness and to be sort of on the other end of. On the other hand, that was what life was about, and that was probably something that wouldn't have been such a big deal in our time in 2018, but it was a big deal in the 1960s. So,
I guess we've talked about safe places and prohibited spaces. Wanted to ask you about endpoints of contact. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the solidarity and cohesiveness of the Black community itself, the African American community. Who provided leadership for the Black community?
well, first of all, there are professionals in the Black community, which is interesting because there are very few Black professionals in Lexington today. And so there are a lot more of them in the 1950s and the 1960s. As I mentioned before, there were 2 Black physicians, both of whom had been trained at Meharry Medical School. There was also a Black dentist in Lexington. There were 16 Black school teachers in Lexington who were on the faculty of Lilburn Downing School. There were Black entrepreneurs who had businesses on Main Street. And so there was a vibrant middle-class Black community, and certainly out of that Black community, there is leadership. Even though the school, Lilburn Downing School, is owned by Rockbridge County, from principal down was all Black. And so there are certainly leaders within this community. There are also Black businesses that influence Lexington that are from outside. For instance, one of the most successful Black businesses historically in the United States during the early 20th century was a Black insurance agency called North Carolina Mutual. And so a lot of Black folks in Lexington were subscribers to North Carolina Mutual, and there was an agent who would come around weekly collecting their premiums for their insurance policies. That agent who comes to mind ended up being also local president of the NAACP. And so there's a local chapter of the NAACP, and what the local chapter of the NAACP does when I'm a boy, I don't really know. But so there were those kinds of leaders. The churches also have well-educated ministers, First Baptist and Randolph Street Methodist. And so there's leadership within those churches. And so there is a kind of solidarity within these organizations. And in your notes earlier, I noticed Oddfellows and Masons. So those are also organizations that are black, even though they are white counterparts that have the same names. And so within the black community, there are people who are hopeful, there are people who are working for change. One of the most extraordinary examples of leadership is that there was constant parading back and forth to school board offices in Lexington and Buena Vista to beg. And I mean, these people are literally like hat in hand and assuming the most humble demeanor to beg for improvements in the schools. And so there is, and this is happening during the 1930s, the 1940s, and I've read these school board minutes, and you see these people who are going back and forth, begging for better bathrooms in the school, or a cafeteria, or whatever. And the idea that somehow if you can make the school better, then your child is going to have a better opportunity in the future. So there is a kind of leadership that is not as profound, if you will, as those people who are trying to kick over Jim Crow, but are just trying to create a better situation within the constraints of Jim Crow segregation. And in fact, a lot of this begins to work. In 1948, just to sort of pick that as a rough date, but it's also a post-war date when attitudes are beginning to change. But beginning in 1948, you see some real improvements in at least the building facilities of black schools in this part of the state. And so there is a great effort to equalize schools. And after the Brown decision is handed down in 1954, there's some people who think, well, gee whiz, let's just try to keep equalizing these schools to keep the black people happy, because then maybe Brown won't be fully implemented. And so there's this kind of activism that takes place at least to improve schools or to improve neighborhoods or whatever. And certainly I'm thankful that there are people who are doing this. There's also an effort that begins in the 1950s to get a black member on city council, which is pretty futile. And a black member of city council doesn't come about until 1969. But at least there are people who understand that there's ways to bring about change, and maybe black representation on city council, maybe black activism with regard to promoting better schools, a stronger black PTA, for instance. It's a way of bringing about general improvement. Also the teachers, the public school teachers, the ones who are younger, who are more optimistic about Brown v. Board and think, oh, well, gee whiz, this is really going to happen, then they are pushing their students to become the best students they possibly could be, because they're going to have to compete with these white kids eventually. I think that some of the older black teachers sort of looked at Brown v. Board and thought, it's just rhetoric, it's not going to happen, and and they were almost right, because it took so long for the implementation. But it's that kind of thing that's happening in the black community that may not seem so profound, but it's an important kind of leadership that looks to the future and looks to probably more practical ways of preparing younger generations for future change.
So it sounds like, and I'm summarizing this in a few other comments, in the post-war period, we could say after World War II, and perhaps Korea was a factor also. You've got African-American veterans coming in, and then Brown versus Board of Education. It almost sounds as though after 1945, even if the change isn't happening yet, there's an expectation of change.
Well, one of the things that happens is that there are soldiers who come back from World War II, and what they have seen with the end of the war and black units helping to bring the war to an end in Europe, a change in attitudes for the young generation of GIs who's returning to the United States. On the heels of that, Harry Truman becomes a president. And Harry Truman surprises all of his own relatives by being very, very progressive, because he is infuriated by some of the abuses of black GIs who have just returned, who are still in uniform. For instance, one who is beaten up on a bus in South Carolina and injured pretty badly. And Truman is so outraged that he makes statements about this and how outrageous it is that these GIs who have done such service for the country are returning home to be brutalized. And so that Truman ends up beginning to push for the earliest civil rights change of the 20s. And with Truman's pushing, then you have the incredible election of 1948, where Truman gets smeared as a liberal who wants to bring about racial change. And on the other hand, you've got Strom Thurmond, who bolts the Democratic Party to run on the Dixiecrat Party against Truman. And you also have a liberal wing of the Democratic Party that bolts and runs against Truman. So Truman has a Republican and two Democrats running against him and manages to pull the election out. And so the election of 1948, which does have great significance with regard to race and progress, it's a part of the change that's coming. And then Truman will, by the stroke of a pen, integrate the armed forces. And so change is happening in the late 1940s. So when I selected 1948 as sort of a date to pull out of my cap, then it's a significant date, because with regard to race relations, the Truman era is the earliest that we can see this kind of promise.
So you have an African-American middle class of teachers and doctors and lawyers and so forth who are very alert to what's going on the national scene, and presumably projecting a lot of this information down into the rest of the community.
Yeah, and the one thing that I would point out is that they also read the newspapers. I mean, my grandfather had a subscription to the Richmond Times-Dispatch, which was a terribly conservative newspaper, but it was delivered to the front porch every morning. And my grandparents read the Richmond Times-Dispatch. They knew what was in the news. They knew what was going on. And one of the things that I've read some of those Richmond Times-Dispatches professionally in my own research, and some of them are really surprising. For instance, 2 or 3 days after the Brown decision is promulgated, there's the most incredible article in the Richmond Times-Dispatch. I mean, it was like one of those, is this my heart attack moment when I was reading it? And this one was an article that the best trained teachers in Virginia and the ones who were most easily retained, who stayed in the teaching profession, were black. But getting white parents to accept these black teachers would be a problem. And so I'm sitting there reading this article, and they actually have written this and published this, that black teachers are better trained than white teachers.
And should be brought into white classrooms?
But the problem is whether white parents will accept them. But the problem for me with regard to research was, how are black teachers better trained than white teachers? And that was an easy piece of information to ferret out. For instance, there were 3 levels of certification. One was normal certification, which meant you only had 2 years of college. And so there were people literally all the way up to 1965 who were teaching on normal certificates. Another level of certification was collegiate, and collegiate speaks for itself. You had a bachelor's degree. The third level of certification was professional, which meant you had a master's degree or higher. What the problem here is that black teachers were competing against one another for a finite number of jobs, since they could only teach in black schools. And so if you are going to be best qualified to compete against other black teachers, you're going to have the highest certification you possibly can. And so black teachers were clamoring to have more than the normal certification. And so at the time of desegregation, there were a lot of white teachers who were still teaching on normal certificates, but there were very, very few black teachers who were still teaching on normal certificates, because just to get the jobs in the Jim Crow world, they had to have either a collegiate or a professional certificate. But then the other hand is the Richmond Times-Dispatch publishes that, and there's a black researcher who's reading this some more than 40 years later thinking, oh my God, I can't believe the Richmond Times-Dispatch has said that. And then to think, well, what would a white parent have thought when they were reading that in 1954? So.
Well, Ted, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the role of the churches here in the African American community.
Well, the first 10 years of my life were spent at Randolph Street Methodist Church, which was my grandparents' church. And my mother was very active in the Methodist Church, but when my mother was going through divorce and whatever, she became inactive. And after she remarried, she was really inactive, although she contributed financially to Randolph Street Church. And so we were kind of free to do what we wanted to. And 7 Tucker Street is around the corner from the original St. Patrick's Catholic Church, because the original St. Patrick's Catholic Church was on Henry Street, which is where there's a Church of Christ in God now, which is a black church. And the first priest in town was a guy named Father Aloysius Selhorst, and he was the first parish priest. And he belonged to a religious community called the Precious Blood Fathers, who are based in Dayton, Ohio. And so he was stationed here, and there were always a few black Catholics around. My mother-in-law, who I didn't know then, when she would be in Lexington because of my father-in-law being stationed someplace that she couldn't go. But she was a cradle Catholic who was born in Pennsylvania, but she went to Mass there. And there was always a teacher or two at Lilburn Downing who was Catholic who would go to Mass there. But when I was a kid, Father Selhorst evangelized 3 African American boys, and I was one of the 3. And so I was actually baptized at St. Patrick's when I was 11 years old. Well, let me think. Yeah, when I was 11 years old. And so I grew up in St. Patrick's. The churches were, as they almost still are, the most segregated hour in of the week is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. So all of the churches in Lexington are still mostly like that, with a few exceptions.
Segregated?
Segregated.
Separate black, white churches.
Right. Part of the segregation today is cultural more than anything else, but when I was a kid, that was not the way. And so the black churches who would always welcome white visitors, and occasionally there would be white visitors, especially since graduation from Lilburn Downing School for a long time took place in First Baptist Church. And but there was no gym when that was happening. That was before they built a gym over at Lilburn Downing. So if they were going to have a graduation ceremony, the only place that they could do it would be at First Baptist Church, and it would be a big to-do. And of course, there would be the white members of the school board, et cetera, who would be there. But with regard to St. Patrick's, one of the things that I sort of look back fondly at is that at 10:30 Mass, when I was growing up in the 50s and the early 60s, every Sunday morning at 10:30 Mass, there was a white guy who was my age named Dennis Morgan, and he and I were the two altar boys at St. Patrick's Church. And in those days, altar boys did a lot more than altar servers do today, because they answered all of the responsorial prayers in Latin for the congregation. And so you had these classes where you were learning how to pronounce, and you were doing some degree of memorizing, but there were always prayer cards for the altar boy to use. But it was sort of a heavy responsibility when you think about the fact that those very same prayers that the whole congregation answers today in English, a teenage boy was answering for the congregation in Latin when I was growing up. But one of the things that was really wonderful about St. Patrick's, and I think that it's because the Catholic Church was pretty much of a church of immigrants, and particularly where the Catholic Church becomes located in the South, because Catholic churches, even in Virginia, especially in this part of Virginia, are still few and far apart. It's like maybe one to a county or something, if that. And so I have nothing but fond memories of the way I was treated by people who were white at St. Patrick's when I was growing up. And a lot of those people were very different from people here because their last names ended in vowels. And so there was a movement of immigrant people to the South in search of jobs, and people who did not seem to have the same racial hang-ups that people who had been born and reared in Rockbridge County had. And so I have nothing but fond memories of growing up in St. Patrick's Church. And then on Monday afternoons after school, there would be religious education classes, and there would be nuns who would come from Clifton Forge to teach these religious ed classes. And so this was a taste of like school integration, and certainly a token taste of school integration. And so it was learning the catechism in classes that were conducted by nuns. But I never, ever remember being treated in any kind of disrespectful manner in that church. And there were a lot of other churches, by contrast, and and they've come a long ways, but I can use Grace as an example. There were two teachers. There were two teachers at Lilburn Downing School who attended First Baptist Church, and they were graduates of St. Paul's College in Lawrenceville, Virginia. Well, St. Paul's College is a historically black college that was Episcopalian. And at one point, the Joneses decided that they really didn't enjoy going to the Baptist church, that they were really Episcopalians, and they were going to go to then Robert E. Lee Episcopal Church. And members of the congregation were so upset that they asked the pastor to ask the Joneses not to come anymore. And that pastor, as I recall, and I may have my chronology wrong, but as I recall, that pastor was Joseph Fletcher. And Joseph Fletcher, who made quite a name for himself in the church, but also had a very, very famous sister named Louise, who was an actress. And he refused to tell the Joneses to stop coming to church. The Joneses stuck it out in the church, and until they left after Lilburn Downing desegregated. But Dolores Jones was a mezzo-soprano, and she ended up contributing richly to the church music with her voice at Robert E. Lee Church. But as I understand it, a lot of people, well, maybe not a lot, but there were people who stopped going to that church because of the Joneses. I know nothing that is parallel, excuse me, I know nothing that is parallel to that with regard to St. Patrick's. I know of no people who stopped going because there were occasional black members. And there certainly were not a lot of black members, but there were black members, and there were black adult members as well. So, in a nutshell, that is what the churches were like, and I don't think that the churches have changed very much. I know that there's been a lot of goodwill and a lot of effort on the part of Lexington Presbyterian, but people go sort of where they want to go. The interesting thing about Lexington Presbyterian is that there's that famous slave Sunday school that they had that ran from the 1850s until the 1880s. And for there not to be any local black Presbyterians in Lexington seems to be extraordinarily interesting given that history. But anyway.
Well, St. Patrick's sounds like it was an unusually desegregated space in an otherwise segregated society.
It was. And then, of course, St. Patrick's, well, the Catholic Church is sort of a top-down kind of church. And so if the bishop makes a pronouncement that things are going to be thus and so, or the priest does, then certainly in those ages or in those times, it's not going to go against the will of the priest. One of the things that I would say is that prior to 1954, Catholic schools in Virginia were segregated. But when the Brown decision was handed down, the Bishop of Richmond said, no more, we are integrated. So the very first schools that become integrated in the state of Virginia are parochial schools. Mm-hmm.
Possibly a last point, if we've got time for this. The role of businessmen in the black community. There seem to have been a number of successful African-American businesses, as we've indicated, in that block of Main Street between Washington and Henry Street. Surely well-to-do black businessmen must have had a leadership role in the community.
Well, the Walker Woods family was the most affluent black family in town. And historically, Harry Walker was the grocer who had his grocery shop in what becomes the Wilson Walker House. The family owned that building through, probably through the 1980s. But that family had a lot of very valuable real estate. And so you have to think about the town in a very, very smaller dimension. Harry Walker's farm was just on the periphery of Lexington. And so his farm land ran from Kroger's east. And so all down that hill was Harry Walker's farm. And so the family leased those properties out there where those businesses are for 100 years. And so the family made a great deal of money off of real estate, and eventually those properties were sold. But it was a period of time where there was some movement of blacks into town and whites out of town. And so Harry Walker is able to buy Blandome, which had been a Tucker home. And
This is a very distinguished Italianate house that goes back, I guess, Civil War generals stayed in that house.
Yeah, I forget when it's built, but it's probably early 19th century house. And so the family owns that house, and the family is very prominent in organizations that are larger than Lexington. For instance, Harry Walker's wife was a member, as that Lexington book demonstrates, that picture book, of the Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, which was a national movement of women activists. And so they also are able to, as a black family, they're able to afford to educate all 6 of their children. And their son, Edwin, becomes one of the first medical doctors to graduate from the University of Virginia Medical School. And I think that he graduates sometimes around 1954. And he is the only surviving one of his siblings at this point. But it was an interesting family, interesting situation that they fell into with regard to being able to make a fortune off of real estate. And there's another factor that I don't know whether it's apocryphal or not, but the other thing that I've always heard is that they also once won the Irish sweepstakes. So I don't know whether that is really true or not, but the real estate part certainly puts them on easy street.
Okay.
So.
Well, Ted, we've covered an awful lot of ground this morning. I guess I'd like to ask you if there are any memories or issues that we haven't discussed that you would like to share before we wind down.
I think that we probably come to a good stopping point, and so I don't have anything that I want to add right now.
Well, good. I'll look forward to our next discussion then. Thank you.
Thank you.